This is a very unique panel because I think this is the only military panel, if you will. Inherent to what we're talking about today is about military, right? So, and the military needs. So, and very important to have the perspective, I think, from two, what I would call warfighters, in the sense that they provide perspective on, not just a technical and capital perspective that we heard a lot about today, and a startup perspective, but really about the operational need of why this is important. Like, why are we doing this? And so the question will kind of revolve around that. And since, production is the new deterrence, is really, really important in this regards. So beside myself, we have Lieutenant General retired Dennis Gyllenspore, who's also the associate professor at the Swedish Defense University, but also is the new NATO chair for the NATO Diana, if you're board of NATO directors, excuse me. Also an esteemed officer in the Swedish Army for many years, obviously retired as a lieutenant general. To his left is Major General Ed Hertz Vaughan, who is currently with the director of the Joint Rapid Acquisition Cell with the Office of Secretary of Defense within the U.S. Department of Defense. Obviously, I know General Vaughan very well, and he has a long combat history as a fighter pilot. So it provides a very unique perspective here, not just from his days in uniform, but obviously from his senior position, also working in Europe in his previous assignments, and then really thinking about, from dealing with Ukraine and what we see the evolution of these technologies. So really excited to have this conversation here and to really bring them on stage to really kind of get their perspective on how we see deterrence going forward. So, sir, first question to both of you. I'm going to ask a very simple question. Why is production considered the new deterrence today?
Is it on? Yeah. No. Thank you, Glenn. Before I answer this question directly, I want to expand a bit and put the question in context, because I think what we're experiencing now is a change of paradigm when it comes to deterrence and defense, and the underlying current in the production is scalability. And from a military perspective, what we have seen over the last decades have been a very deliberate focus on information dominance, precision strike, decisive operation that were assumed to be rapid and being able to conduct these operations over long distances. Many of these things will prevail, but what we also have seen is that quality is not just the superior aspect with regards to quantity. So we've done quality for quite a lot of time, and to be frank, some nations have done force reductions disguised as quality efforts, but in reality it's been a way to cut forces. Now everything changed with Ukraine, because we have seen in so many ways that the warfare conducted there is different. It is about high quality, but at the same time it also speaks to the volume, to quantity. In Europe, nations are reconsidering conscript system. In Europe, we've seen now initiatives on stockpiling, ammunition, and so on. We also see the need for making use of innovation, not just innovation, but employ it in mass scale. So that's where this fits in, to be as a part of a bigger effort to change the way we operate on a military perspective. And I would argue that NATO as an alliance is the ultimate entity for scaling in defense. Remembering that the Article 5 stipulates that if one country is being attacked, the other 31 will step in and help out. And that's scalability at its very essence. And so that's where also the industry aspects have to come in, because NATO is not doesn't have the resources and the mandate to do industrial aspects. A few points on what NATO is doing that have some touch points on this. When it comes to the government side, NATO is doing quite a lot and has done so for many years in terms of standardization, interoperability, multilateral programs for procurement to allow nations to procure at scale and also efficiently. That will obviously continue. We have a procurement agency that could also help out on the procurement side. Having said that, there's a lot more to be done. I won't go into it now, but there are many aspects that need to improve. DIU has managed to make use of the national legislation for procurement to find a way forward. And I think that should serve as an inspiration for other countries within their legal frameworks. The other aspect, just briefly, is about the financial institutions. And we heard NIF, the NATO Innovation Fund, here earlier. They play an extremely important role for the alliance to facilitate funding. My only point here is that it is so much broader, and I think we have to look at the breadth of financial institutions, starting with angel funds, including the whole range to sovereign wealth funds, to find different actors at different instances that can help scale. They have different risk assessments and different profit mechanisms, and we will probably need to use all of them. And my final point is on the government side, to be able to scale up, on the industrial side to scale up, and that's the push signal from the industry. And speaking on behalf of Diana, we serve as one vehicle in NATO for that purpose, mainly to kind of identify, cultivate innovators to join the effort in the defense community. And it's very promising to see that there are so many companies that are interested and engaged in the defense aspects now. We had a round of challenge formation to attract innovators, and out of 2,600 applicants, we vetted 74 that has now gone further. It speaks about the potential here. We are only able to focus on a few of them to help them to move forward. Diana is also a part of a bigger effort to make sure that the nations come together and use resources in a more efficient way. We have accelerators at national capacities that we connect now, and also test facilities, test centers. To date, we have 182 test centers throughout the alliance, a huge assets for the defense industry to tap into, and to make sure that they can enter the defense market. I think I'll stop there.
No, thank you very much. Thanks, Glenn. General, it's a great privilege to be here. I appreciate DIU and MSC and of course the sponsors of this event. Deterrence is cognitive warfare. People think of deterrence in grand scales because that's how you affect the cognitive part, but with most of our adversaries around the world, these are autocracies. So we're really talking about changing the minds, or the mind, of one or a couple of people. So how do you get into the brain of your adversary and convince them that attacking is not worth it? We have deterrence by punishment, deterrence by denial. And no matter which way you look at it, there's other forms of deterrence as well. But what we want to do is get into the brain of our adversary. So it reminds me, when I was a kid, I grew up in Florida. We used to have rock fights. I don't know how many of you threw rocks at each other. We would have organized rock fights. And you throw rocks at each other, and there were rules. Not many. It's a rock fight, right? It's not many rules, but basically the size of your fist. You couldn't throw a rock bigger than that. And the rock fight ended if somebody was injured to the extent that they probably needed stitches, lost a tooth. We didn't have very many limbs or eyes lost like you do in real warfare, but this was a rock fight. And you could also end if one side just completely conceded. But that was the ultimate in shame. And so no kid wanted to do that. You wanted to keep fighting until, or we all ran out. The we all ran out part became very interesting because there was this one gang in the neighborhood that started winning all the rock fights, and we were their chosen victim for the day. And what they would do is they had a kid on their team that didn't throw any rocks. There's no rule about that. All he would do is go around and gather more rocks. And so at some point during the rock fight, they pushed out this stack of rocks to let us know that they could fight all day. And it's amazing as we talk about this right now, and I think back to that, and I remember seeing that pile of rocks and looking at, we had some in our pockets. And I looked at the guys next to me, I said, I think it's time to go. Because they can fight all day. And unless you're ready to hit that guy square in the nose and everybody had cover, you could go. So this is deterrence, because we were deterred in that phase. We were deterred because, in that case, our adversary, a bunch of kids throwing rocks, had basically a limitless supply. And so this is really a question, this production capacity to deterrent effect. I think it always has been. I think it's even more so now. And the production capacity comes down to what are you producing? Are you producing something that's decisive in warfare? So if you have tremendous production capacity for something that does not scare your enemy or at least cause your enemy to take pause, then that's not going to be an effective deterrent. And so let me go back to this investment piece, and we'll talk more about that later. I've got some points to make about risk capital and venture capital and how we approach that. But if you go to Kyiv, or you go to Taiwan, or you go to places that are under imminent threat or under attack, they have investors, they have banks, they have businesses. You don't see a lot of companies or investment funds in those locations saying, oh no, we don't invest in defense. Oh no, we don't do that. We have ethics, we have morals. It's interesting how when you're under attack, all those ethics and morals start to become challenged. So what I would tell you is, let's not wait. And this is for the Euro-Atlantic discussion. It's on both sides of the Atlantic. Let's not wait until we're actually under kinetic attack to decide, maybe we ought to invest in defense. Maybe we see our way clear to investing in those means and those resources that actually allow us to make these decisions, that give us that freedom. And so this gets back to something my Secretary of Defense talked about, which is it is vital that the Euro-Atlantic remain free and independent and self-governing and sovereign and not let anybody encroach on that. And I think that's a place everybody agrees. Even those investors, those banks, those organizations that choose not to invest in defense, and I say choose because they have the choice, even those banks, those investors would probably agree that free, sovereign, independent is valuable. And so the question is, if you don't believe that's under threat, you have no motivation to put money into the means of production. And so I think part of our challenge right here, there's a lot. There's regulations, there's investment, there's TRL levels, and we'll get into some of those. But a part of our challenge is messaging. And we who are acutely aware of the threat have not adequately messaged that threat and why we think the threat is imminent. And what happens is people that are removed from it, and again, that's one of the greatest things about having a modern civil society is you have people that can explore art their whole lives and music, and I'm glad they do. I love that stuff. But if they don't understand the threat we're under, it's going to be very hard for them to get behind these kind of investments. And when they elect democratically elected officials, they won't elect officials who can get behind that either. And so I would say that part of our takeaway from here and part of MSC writ large is that we need to come to some agreement on what is the threat, how imminent is it, and if you ask our Ukrainian brothers and sisters in the crowd, they will certainly give you a valid position on that. And then we need to propagate that messaging. We need to share it, and we need to communicate.
Thank you, sir. The story about rocks really resonates with me as a Marine, so yeah. I appreciate that. So I'm going to come back to you again for this because you brought up risk, and I know that's a topic near and dear, and we've talked about it. risk is inherent to military operations. Anyone who wears a uniform understands that. But there's different types of risk. And especially for many of you who don't wear the uniform or have not experienced it, there's different types of risk. And in this case, technical risk or capital risk, which many of you are familiar with. So, sir, my question is, how do we talk about risk from a defense perspective and see it, and specifically in the case for the group here, and look at it less as a liability but more of an opportunity?
No, that's great. And so in the Joint Rapid Acquisition Cell, it's something we wrestle with on a daily basis. If you go to your handy AI app, whichever one you happen to use, and ask for a definition of risk, it will provide probably 4 or 5 good definitions that are out there. They're not all the same. So we use a working definition of risk, understanding that people see it differently. We consider risk as the uncertainty in outcomes. We don't put a negative spin on the definition of risk. Some do, right? And that's fair. But the uncertainty in outcomes, so you have an expected outcome, you have an actual outcome, and the delta between those two is where we see risk. An outcome can be financial, it can be strategic. This morning, for example, I don't know, how many walked here from your accommodations? How many of you thought walking here was going to be a high-risk endeavor? I didn't, for sure. I don't think I thought much of it. But I think many of you know there was an attack earlier. I guess it's still being sorted out. But a car plowed into a crowd not a kilometer from here, right? And so that changes your risk perspective on walking to the event. And and Uber can't get you all the way in, and so there's a zone in there, and we've seen this all over the place. So let me get back to how we talk about it in this framework. What we see happening, especially in risk capital, is there's a mismatch of incentives. If we don't invest in startups that are doing the things we need to be deterrent or to be victorious in war, if we don't invest in those startups, who absorbs the risk of that lack of investment, of that non-decision? The population, let's broadly say the government. So on behalf of the population, the government absorbs that risk. So when there's a lack of decision, lack of investment, venture capital says, we're not going to do that. They shift the risk to the government, but the risk becomes risk of attack, strategic risk, kinetic risk, however you want to characterize it, and you can have layers on that. If, on the other hand, a investor firm, a venture capital firm, says we're going to invest in this company, it's very low TRL, technology readiness level. They don't have any sales yet. By our metrics, it's really a bad risk decision on our part, but we're going to do it anyway. What just happened? That investment firm, or if it's debt equity from a bank, that bank, you won't see that very often, but let's say an investment firm with an equity investment, they just took risk from the government and said, we're going to absorb some of that risk. We're going to take risk from the population and the government, the risk of attack. We're going to take that on and invest in deterring that attack. Now, the levels and the amounts vary quite a bit. It's a scale difference. But the structure is set up so that really the investment community makes a risk decision one way or another, and they get to impose that risk back on the government. They don't mean to. It's not deliberate that way. It's just the way it's set up. And so when you have governments, and I'll talk about my own, but any government out there that hyper-regulates or creates disincentive to investing risk capital, it's actually in the government, it's counter to the government's interest to transfer that risk. And so if you just want to boil it down to the way we talk about risk and the way we see risk, there is an ability out there for the government to reduce its strategic risk by reducing the barriers to investment. You can't make that company more attractive necessarily, but what you can do potentially is remove the barriers for those companies to exercise the courage we talked about in one of the earlier panels. And so I think the risk discussion is a little more nuanced. I also think you need different people engaged in the risk discussion. We talked about earlier who's missing from that conversation about risk and deterrence, and I think labor is super important. There are a lot of folks that have already fast-forwarded to 10, 20 years, maybe 3 years, I don't know. But they fast forwarded to where we don't actually have human labor building large things. And we may get there one day, and certainly there's a lot of folks trying to get us there. But we're not there yet. We actually need people. My first 10 years before I was full-time in uniform, I worked in the private sector. I started as a welder. And so the folks that said they needed welders, you know, I'll be available when I retire next year if they need a welder for something. Not that good, but I can do it. But the point is we do need labor, and we need to bring labor into these discussions. We also need to bring the regulators into these discussions, and we need to bring the warfighter in. Not just the people that not just generals, but the warfighters. And then have a great conversation about risk and make a decision on how we're going to get after that risk and how we're going to treat it for strategic advantage for our nations and collectively for the Euro-Atlantic region.
Thank you, sir. So do you want to?
Can I just add a facet of this? The other week I visited a garage company that was producing underwater drones, and very capable and tested, and everything seems to be well in place for procurement by one of the defense organizations. And I asked them, so what's the life cycle of this vehicle? How long will it be able to operate? And they said, we have no idea. 1 year, 2 years, 4 years, but we don't know because we've just assembled it with off-the-shelf components. But that's not an issue because we'll be able to produce new ones and better ones in 1 or 2 years. So we don't see that as a showstopper. But they also said that apparently the procurement organization thinks otherwise. And here's a lesson for us, I think, from the government side. And talking about regulation, we have a risk-avert culture when it comes to procurement with the mindset that we will have all the requirements specified before we can enter into a contractual relationship with a company. But the world moves faster and technology moves faster, so we have to accept that some of the procurements that we are doing will not be successful. The gadget won't work as intended, but that's okay. Absence of success is not failure, and we will learn as we go along. And because speed is now of essence when it comes to procurement and delivering to our combat units. So the risk appetite or the risk management needs to be changed in the procurement organization.
Thank you, sir. General Gyllenspore, I'm going to put this back to you. You have a very unique background because you're not just a retired Swedish officer, general officer, but you now work and represent NATO, Diana, different perspective. You also have a perspective as a country that was not part of NATO, but is now part of NATO. So it gives you kind of a unique, I think, perspective for us. And so how have you seen the evolution, if you could, briefly, how Sweden has viewed defense industry and defense investment and production from a country perspective, but now as part of an alliance?
Well, thank you. We've been very much involved in NATO as a partner for a long time, but still we haven't been a member. The legacy in Sweden, and I think that also applies to Finland, is that our defense has been designed as a defense for deterrence by denial, basically making it so costly for an aggressor to attack, so they will stay away from it. And that means a strong armed forces. It also means to have a domestic production capacity, defense industry, and also a civil organization, civil defense organization for critical infrastructure protection, population security, and so on. And so all that has been a part of the fabric of the society during the Cold War, and stockpiling of ammunition and food and so on. Now we, in all honesty, we got rid of some of it, sadly, but we have the framework there and the history, and some of the structures are still there. So what we call the total defense aspect, the resilience, cuts across the society, I think is something that NATO would need more of, that kind of thinking, and also operationalization. And I think Sweden and Finland and some other countries also can contribute to that conversation, so that NATO actively contributes to the wider effort of societal resilience in the allied countries.
Thank you, sir. We've got about 5 minutes left. So, General Vaughan, in this regards, and kind of pulling off this theme of the previous question, where does DoD, or specifically from your perspective within the JRAC, see this kind of this new industry, and I refer to a lot of the folks here as this new industry, in this fight for the future?
Yes, I've talked about theoretical things. Let's talk very practical things. So the newer industries are the ones that are going to provide the asymmetric competitive advantage that we need to deter and then to win when fighting. The bulk of our United States military and the bulk of NATO's military are sort of the legacy systems that, frankly, Russia and China can outproduce us. If you could argue they could outproduce us, at least China, in just about any sector right now. So we really have to up the game. Let me talk about a couple things that have worked. In our office, we take about 4 or 5 pitches every week. We just crossed our 100th pitch since I've been there about a year. And we hear all the various startups, and they're all brilliant. And they're all at different TRL levels and what they're pitching. What they don't all have is a plan to scale. And that's really important, because some companies come in, and again, I'm not making light of this. I'm just seeing this as a reality. And I said, well, tell me how you plan to scale this, because we're going to need a lot. Well, we were making 1 a week. Now we make 10 a week, so we think we know how to do it. I said, okay. And to the gentleman earlier, when we had the industry panel, we're talking scaling to 100,000 to 1 million to 10 million this year, in 1 year. How do you scale to that? There's not the labor workforce out there and everything else. So let me give you 3 things that we've used in DoD that have worked for us to help with this. We have another organization called the Joint Production Acceleration Cell, and Dr. Erin Simpson wasn't able to join us for this, otherwise she'd be here probably on the panel. 3 things: multi-year procurement. Congress has authorized the DoD to do multi-year procurement. That provides enough certainty to get over that valley of death of runway, funding runway. The next one's called facilitization. It's a mouthful, but really what it means is that the government actually invests in your new facilities so that you can scale to the next level. And the third one is investing in long lead time supply chain items. So if we know we're going to ask you to do 1 million of these or 10,000 of these next year, and we know that these are your bottlenecks on supply chain, we can invest early in those and have those ready for you, so when you get to that part of the production, you don't slow down at all. There's about 10 others that didn't work, but those are the 3 that are working really, really well. Anyway, I'll yield back the time. Thank you.
And General Gyllenspore, on that theme, and we're talking about the role of Diana from General Vaughan's comments, and Diana has a very unique, as it's the Alliance's premier accelerator. And I think it has a real active role in kind of fostering this ecosystem where we see these asymmetric advantages going to come from. Can you describe where you think Diana's contribution is going to be this in, say, 5 to 10 years? Because it's fairly new, come around a couple of years. And so I want to talk about, let's talk about the long-term success, because really this is what about planting the seed for the future. And I think this is really going to be the value add that we're going to see for Europe going forward, and NATO specifically.
Thank you. I should start by emphasizing that we're still in a build-up phase, and we expect to reach full operational capability during this year. Now, having said that, there are a couple of areas that I think we can make a difference for the Alliance and for the defense writ large. The first one is the ecosystems themselves of innovation. And it's fascinating to see how different the innovation has taken root in the different countries. Not surprising, but it is in some cases fundamentally different. Some are very mature, some have just started, and there are different approaches within the governments and so on. And I'm not proposing or suggesting that should be streamlined. On the contrary, I think it has to flourish from the national perspective. But what I see happening over the next 5 years is that we will be able to build a strong fabric of innovation, connecting what is now a couple of islands and making sure that there is connectivity so that we can be more agile. Because if we have a fundamental challenge now or in the future that we need to address, we need to come together much quicker. I mean, just to take an example now, we are struggling in the alliance with subsea or undersea infrastructure, critical infrastructure that has been sabotaged, and we need to find solutions. That requires thinking, input from various parts of the innovation ecosystem. If it's well connected, I think we'll be able to deliver solutions quicker. The other point is, of course, to build a much stronger culture of innovation. I think in many ways, countries have a culture of innovation, but not in the defense area. To bridge that gap now is a challenge, and we need to be reaching out much more from the defense community to meet and engage with innovators. And I think that Diana is one of those vehicles that will help us. And last but not least is, of course, to deliver capabilities, because there are so many opportunities that stem from new technology and bright, creative minds. Sometimes overconfident, but we need that. And so we need to make sure that we will connect them with the defense challenges that we have in a seamless way. And I think that we are building those bridges. But 5 years from now, I think this will hopefully be something that will enable us to turn around requirements much quicker than we do today.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, that concludes our panel. General Vaughan will be out back if you want to have a rock fight with him, so it'll be a good time. But no, just kidding. Thank you for your time and effort, time being here. And, ladies and gentlemen.